This episode's guest is Robert Dayton, the author of Cold Glitter, the Untold Story of Canadian Glam. Robert, welcome to the podcast.
Oh, thanks so much for having me.
Tell us about yourself. Your website bio says you are from Fort St. John, British Columbia. You are a multidisciplinary artist.
Yeah, and both those things were were important for me to put in my bio. Bios are hard to write, especially if you're writing it by yourself, which most people are. I certainly am, and it's always a challenge. It's like, oh, I have to write about myself, and how do I get the ego out of this? It's not an easy thing. It's a rough challenge, but
Well, multidisciplinary artist means you have many creative muscles you can flex. Is that the good way to put it?
I remember, I've lived in a few different cities, and I remember like when I realized at one point it was very important for me to put Fort St. John, because that's where I spent almost half my life. That's where I'm from. That's where I was born. What is it on the map? It's an isolated place. It's on the Alaska Highway. It's way up in northern British Columbia. And, I had so many insecurities about it. And, when I moved to the big city at 19, I moved to the big city and I was like, hey, I didn't even want to tell anyone where I was from. I was so insecure about where I was from. And no, man. So I get over that. And now it's like, no, this is in my bio. This is where I was born and raised. This is where I'm from. And then I moved to another city. I moved to Toronto. And, I remember someone going, what's your focus? And I'm like, what's my focus? What do you mean by that? And then someone said, hey, just say multidisciplinary. And I'm like, all right, multidisciplinary. You do a lot of different things. And, that applies to the book. I mean, the book has so many different factors. And, my history is acknowledged with that. My background is acknowledged with that. And then, it's all this stuff that I love that's mixing so many different things. Being in bands for myself, I thought it was normal that you want to put on a show, and you find out, no, it's not normal to want to put on a show. You want to dress up, to like have a theme, to have a concept, to have like makeup. That's not normal. It's oh, okay. So that's a bit multidisciplinary in its own right. And a lot of these bands do that. So
yeah, you talk about a scene that needs some light shed on it. And that's what this book does. Actually, on the back of the book is a quote from actor, writer, and comedian Neil Hamburger, who describes the music scene you cover in this book as being, quote, a mysterious, undocumented scene that was hiding in plain sight up north. Tell us about Canadian glam, and why was it so marginalized?
It's funny. It's kind of a catch-all crux in a way, Canadian glam. A lot of people, when I bring it up, or when I have brought it up, even when I started writing the book, were going, is there such a thing? And, I'd interviewed these bands, and some would say, yeah, we're glam. And some would say, well, we're not glam. And some of the bands that said that they were glam were less glam than the bands who didn't say they were glam. But I was going, okay, I'm going to put some qualifiers in for what is glam and what isn't glam, and give people a bit of background on glam in general and overall. And then we'll do it in Canada. We'll go, okay, what's in Canada here? And yeah, some of these bands are definitely not known. And I hate saying that, but yeah, they need to be known. They need to be, basically, these bands, all of these bands, everyone needs to hear.
This all starts around early 70s is when this starts to form this scene.
I mean, glam in general, some people like to pinpoint that glam in general started when, Mark Bolan had some glitter put on his face and went on Top of the Pops and performed Hot Love, which is part of his new sound, where everything's this 50s sound is more heightened, it's bigger, it's more visual. He's got this glitter on his face. Top of the Pops is one of the only shows, really the only show that's playing brand new stuff in England. You don't have a lot of channels back then, and everyone's around the telly watching Top of the Pops to see their favorites do their songs, do their hit songs or soon to be hit or whatever, and get to see this show. And so, a whole nation of people who love music are watching it. All the music lovers in that nation are watching it. And the little glitter on his face, and there's some debate about who put the glitter on. Was it Chalita Secunda, or was it there was a couple women. It's in the book. I'll have to just go back to the book. So that would have been like 71. That's glam overall, that some people like to pinpoint as being, but then there's all these vestiges and all these things that influenced all this stuff that comes before, so history isn't so nice and tidy, and this book isn't so nice and tidy. Because Canada is a big country. We're going from, all the way from west to east and up, and, and all these bands in each province and territory. But, we have glam overall, then we got glam in Canada. So I was going, well, then there's these acts that are somewhat glam-like. So I put it as 1970. I said, let's just start around 70, end around 80, and we'll be kind of I was going, that's kind of because some of this glam stuff goes a little later too, so we'll just keep it sort of nice and tidy.
Yeah, and a daunting task because you break it down into
Hmm.
sections: British Columbia, Saskatchewan, or British Columbia, then Alberta, then Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and Ontario. How
Yeah,
did
we're
you go
moving
about the
forward.
process
Yeah.
of putting this all together and getting information and quotes from the people who were there?
Yeah, it was about a 10-year process overall.
Wow, 10 years.
Yeah. Yeah, it took about 10 years, give or take, off and on. But yeah, it was a long process. And a lot of it was going to these cities. My previous book, would just go on a book tour and go, well, I'm going to Montreal. Well, I'm going to Montreal. It's 2018. I'm going to go to Montreal and interview these guys because, the book is happening. I'm writing it. I'm right in the process. And the other book is finally out. So I'll go do a book launch event and then I'll meet these guys in Montreal and I'll interview them on and on and on. It kind of happened like that. Okay, Toronto I was living in, so I tracked them down there. And then it was like, oh, this book's getting out of hand. It's over 400 pages. This book is
Yeah.
over 400 pages, and there's an addendum chapter of other stuff like magic, comedy, stuff like that. That's like another 100 pages fashion, and so because fashion's pretty key. So yeah, it became over 400 pages. So I didn't know what I was getting into. Uh, I thought, oh, it'll just be a couple hundred pages, and it just grew and grew and grew and grew.
What
It,
I like the way it's broken down because it's not like you have to read it from page 1 to page 400. You could just look through the different sections, the different areas, and read about each. Like I said, so
yeah.
many bands and artists to cover in the book. Let's get to some of them, and apologies to any that we don't cover, but they're all in the book, and any that you want to add along the way, feel free.
Yeah, and they've made some incredible music. They really have.
They
So,
have, and that's the one great thing, and I've said this so many times doing this podcast that I discover new music. For example, the first band, Sweeney Todd, and their original singer, which the name escapes me now. What was it? The
Nick Gilder,
Nick
yeah,
Gilder, and there's a version of the song that there's like 6 different versions of that hit single
Rocky
that's from
Roller.
Roxy Roller. The only
Mhm.
one that's on Spotify is his version that he did after he left. But
Okay,
there's 5 other versions out there, and a very interesting version apparently with a kid by the name of Bryan Adams,
yes,
16 years
yeah.
old at the time. Let's start with this band, Sweeney Todd from Vancouver, British Columbia. Tell us about this band. Bryan Adams, how does he get involved? Because he's there for just like a year, maybe not
Yeah,
even.
it's interesting because it was great that I was able to, apart from the introduction, I was going, well, let's move across Canada, starting at the western part of Canada, which is British Columbia. And it goes, well, that's great. The first chapter can be Sweeney Todd. Right off the bat, we can start with Sweeney Todd because that's the one that a lot of people know, Roxy Roller. And even if they don't know, it's a really good place to start the book. Sweeney Todd with Nick Gilder, it's happening, and then Nick Gilder gets and the guitarist James McCulloch, they get called away for the two of them get called away for Nick Gilder's solo career in L.A. So him and the guitarist are so it's not but it's under Nick Gilder. And so they get called. They moved to LA, and then all these different versions of Roxy, like Roxy Roller, is climbing up the charts. It's actually not even their first single, but it's the one that's becoming the hit. And it's like, well, we got to cash in on this. We got to do this. But then Gilder puts out the version. He's got the masters, so he's put out that version, which I think, God, I have to check back to the book. But there's all these different versions, and then so Sweeney Todd goes and they record a new version with their new singer Clark Perry, and he's in the band for maybe just a couple of months, and they released that, and then he's out, and Bryan Adams is kind of hanging around. He's going, hey, he's a teenager by this point,
16
15 or
years old.
16, yeah, and he joins the band, and he is able to mimic Nick Gilder's voice perfectly. He's able to sing like Nick Gilder, and Nick Gilder has what is the coyest voice in rock. It is like this upper range, slinky, sexual, coy voice. More so than say, you could see T Rex as a big influence there, but more so than Bolin even. It's just this voice. And Bryan Adams, who's now known, for his more raspier, kind of earthier voice, he's able to replicate Gilder's voice, and people were disputing, going, "Wait, is there some technical trickery?" My brother saw him perform, saw that lineup of Sweeney Todd
Oh,
perform.
wow.
And
With Bryan Adams, huh?
with Bryan Adams said there was no trickery afoot. And Bud Marr, the bassist, who's been through various, like he had been through the most lineups of Sweeney Todd, and he's the one I interviewed for the Sweeney Todd chapter. And he's so accurate. It is incredible, because we're going back 40. I'm interviewing these people where we're going back 40 years. So there's fact checking. There's a lot going on, but he is totally accurate. It's incredible. And he's going, no, there's no trickery. At one point, he's talking about when the song Roxy Roller is becoming a huge hit. And I think Bryan Adams was in the lineup at that time, and they're playing Nathan Phillips Square in Toronto. And it's packed. It's packed with all these people, over 10,000. I can't remember the exact amount. I look up an Canadian industry magazine, and it's giving 1/10 that amount. I went, oh my gosh, did he exaggerate the amount of people that was at the concert to see them do Roxy Roller? The following week's edition of this industry magazine prints a retraction saying that they got the number wrong. Bud Marr was spot on. It was 10 times that amount. It really was. The magazine got it wrong. Bud Marr got it right. The magazine
10,
from back in 1975 got it wrong. Bud Marr
just tells you how big of a band they were. 10,000.
Yeah, it was more than 10,000, I believe. Yeah, it was there to see these rock stars. And it's in the book. He describes the madness they're in.
What was the song, Brian? It took a shot at Nick Gilder in the lyrics, right? There was one song on the second album.
That's kind of a joy to write about. The hatchet is long buried, I'm told. But at that time, it was a diss track. It was a glam rock, Canadian glam diss track. Song for a Star. It's this great song. It's on the second album, If Wishes Were Horses. And that's all Bryan Adams singing on the second album. There's a couple Nick Gilder written songs on there that Nick Gilder even does on his first solo album. So you get these different versions like Tantalize and stuff. Then there's these songs that are actually written by teenage Bryan Adams with the rest of the band. And one is Song for a Star. And it opens this wonderful song. Glam goodness. It's just incredible. But it opens, he's like, this is a song for a star. If you really are a star. So, and it's kind of a diss at Gilder, who he hadn't even met yet. And then on the cover of the first Nick Gilder solo album, there's a puppet, and it's a red-haired kind of marionette that Nick Gilder's holding. And some say, and it's called "You Know Who You Are" is the name of the album.
Oh,
some say that might be a diss at Bryan Adams.
That's a shot. I love the story when you had the chance to get a quote from Bryan about that album. This is in the late 90s. It's at a gallery opening, and you tried getting him to talk about the second Sweeney Todd album, which he's on. Share this story. I love it.
Yes, it was at an art opening for Basquiat. It was a Basquiat art show. It was Basquiat and Al Hansen, Fluxus artist Al Hansen, who some know as Beck's grandfather. Al Hansen's daughter was there, Beck's mom, and Bryan Adams was wandering around looking at the Basquiats, probably pricing them because he can. He's walking away, and I just kind of go, "Hey, I really love that second Sweeney Todd album." Turns around, walks towards me, and he says, "You and one other guy. He kills bugs for a living." The funny thing is I suspect that I know that guy, but he's a great musician in his own right.
But I was 16 years old. Yeah, so tell me a little bit about, I was 16 years old.
Says, I asked him, I'm keeping like, so what was this process? What was it? I was 16 years old.
At least he confirmed his age, so we know.
Yeah.
All right, one that I know.
The other guy who kills bugs for a living, we suspect that it was my friend Terry, who I've done music and stuff with over the years, and there was a period where he was killing bugs for a living, and there's a fan of the second Sweeney Todd.
Oh, so there's a story behind that quote. That's great.
Terry drums in a very seminal, he's done a lot of things, but he's even got a teen pop sensation that he does called Eye Candy, but he was also the drummer in a band called Slow, S-L-O-W, which is a pivotal part of the North, some say Seattle sound or grunge sound, but it was like the Pacific Northwest sound, very pivotal band. So
one guy, he's known here in the States, is Thor. That's somebody we know about, and we're not talking about the Marvel Comics character. Let's just clarify. But this is Thor, the Canadian singer. You couldn't forget him if you caught one of his shows. I mean, he would stand out. Imagine a member of Kiss decided to become a bodybuilder. That's pretty much what he was like, which makes perfect sense that he actually opened for Kiss in 1976. So tell us who Thor is, and he's got some great quotes in the book.
Yeah, Thor's incredible. And I actually had a real run-in with him in the summer. I'll get to that. So Thor the Rock Warrior, I get to his real early history, which is a joy. I get to see where it all comes together because he always loved bodybuilding, weightlifting, all that stuff. He was a bodybuilder. He was a bodybuilder champion. And he loved rock music and he loved comic books. So he was able to combine all three. And one of his early bands, which was at a real pivotal glam event in Canada, it was at the Commodore. And the Commodore is a very legendary venue in Vancouver. It's known, it's known far and wide as being a legendary venue. It's a beautiful venue. And the Commodore got some great shows. They did have the New York Dolls with Sweeney Todd opening. And they also had this event that was, the band Twitch, who are also in the book, which had real elements, strong elements at the time of horror rock. A lot of proto corpse paint and stage shows of flash pots and burnings and oh yeah, scary stuff. And then the Whiz Kids coming over from Seattle, which was the Whiz Kids came out of the Cockettes, but later Tomato de Plenty went on to the Screamers and all that, and they were kind of like the Cockettes but more glam. And so they're performing, and then it's John Michael Body Rock. So before Thor became Thor, he had a bodybuilder band with spotters and everything. So it was all like do the muscle, stuff like that. And then he became Thor with the imps, these little guys. And so, yeah, he became Thor, the Rock Warrior, and keep the dogs away. And the imps even went on to do solo stuff after Frank Soda. So we cover his story as well. Thor's really impressive. You see his show and it's pure showmanship. He blows up, when I saw even his comeback in 2005, he's still bending the bar with his mouth, blowing up the hot water bottle. He's made movies. There's a comic book. There's a few comic books. Yeah, movie Rock and Roll Nightmare, and then
Right.
further movies as well.
Picture of him doing the split in the book off the stage, and I think you have a shot of that Marvel comic image in here, right? You got his album cover. Oh, here it is. Yeah.
Oh yeah, it's not a Marvel comic, but it is a Thor comic book that's by Ken Landgraf, who's done all sorts of stuff. Ken Landgraf is a really incredible comic book artist, and so he had done this Thor comic, and he's known for other stuff as well. Some stuff of his work is actually getting released, reissued right now by various comic book companies. He's such a great comic artist, Ken Landgraf. So this melding of Thor, the Rock Warrior, with Ken Landgraf is great. There was even one Thor comic that Ken Landgraf put together for a thing called Rock Comics. It was done by the great Neil Adams as well. So Thor's even been photographed by Robert Mapplethorpe. So he's been captured by some of the greatest artists. Yeah, he's just incredible. And I was in Vancouver in the summer. I was at Neptune Records, the great Neptune Records in Vancouver. Shout out to them. And I was on tour with the fellow who's quoted on the back of the book, Greg Turkington. We were doing a show. And, I'm asking Rob, who graciously loaned some of the wonderful images in the Thor chapter and a couple other chapters of the book, particularly in the British Columbia section. So we're asking him about just some various Thor anecdotes. And then in walks Thor. And Thor walked right, it was kismet. I was visiting Vancouver and Thor's just like, oh yeah, you guys want to go for coffee? I got a bit of time. He's like, yes, let's have coffee with Thor. So he's still incredible.
Thunder on the Tundra is the big one, I think, his most popular one.
Yeah, and Keep the Dogs Away.
Keep the Dogs Away, you're right, yep. That's the other thing. I mean, the songs are legitimately badass tunes. I mean, it's legit music. It's like Kiss. I'm a Kiss fan. Everybody likes to say, well, they're all show and no music. I'm like, nah, I don't know about that. Music's pretty good. It's pretty good.
There's a lot of Kiss stuff I love. So,
sure.
I was a Kiss. I mean, when you want to talk about what got me to write the book, I got this oldest brother, my oldest brother, a guitarist, who, brings home the second Sweeney Todd album, brings home all these Kiss albums. All my art that I was making as a little kid was all Kiss art. I remember doing show and tells when I was 5 or 6, bringing this like thing made out of construction paper, this like Gene Simmons Santa Claus with cotton balls for a beard, and bringing it for show and tell, and the teacher going, don't you do anything besides Kiss?
That's awesome. I was the same way. Yeah, the lunchbox, the whole thing. Thor experienced a comeback in the 2000s. You mentioned that. There was a documentary on him, and he still tours today, right? He's still...
Yeah, he still tours today. He tours Europe. He's doing a lot of shows in Europe, and sometimes Frank Soda, who's covered in the book as well, it's the Thor and Frank Soda chapter. because Frank Soda was in the Imps backing Thor and doing all, and Frank Soda does these things like exploding televisions on his head and stuff like that as well. So all these great theatrical elements. And so, yeah, and so sometimes Frank Soda joins him still. So I was able to interview both Thor and Frank Soda, and it was a real joy to talk to both those guys.
Robert Dayton, the author of Cold Glitter, The Untold Story of Canadian Glam. And the book also gets into some of the hot spots like Faces in Vancouver. Tell us about Faces.
Part of my research was trying to find hangouts. Were there glam hangouts? Where would people buy clothes? Where would people go hang out? And, I was told, well, early on, some people were around at that time going, there wasn't really anywhere. And then it's like, wrong. There were some places to buy clothes that were amazing, like Beau Brummel's, on and on and on. But then there was this bar, Faces, and it was a gay bar. And there was a incredible bunch of gay bars at that time in the 70s in Vancouver and stretching on. Vancouver got gentrified, but there's less, I think, now. But Faces was just this great place that started in the early 70s. It was a place you'd go and dance. It was a place you would go and dance. And the manager, Dennis Robbins, I was able to talk to him. Here's Dennis Robbins, and him and Jerry Cole was the DJ. And so they'd go to Seattle, and they had, the finger on the pulse. They get all the great soul, R&B, and glam songs for people to dance to. And they really open up the dance floor. So where, you dance and you're the star as well. Apparently there was a line of glitter leading you to the door. And it was, all these wonderful characters at Faces. And because I just really love this, there was a group that they formed called the Facettes. And the Facettes were a play on San Francisco's Cockettes. Because, Dennis and I think Jerry, a couple of the other folks in the Facettes had actually met the Cockettes in San Francisco. And so they did their own take for the Faces Club called the Facettes. And at one point they dressed as cheerleaders and, shaking pom-poms. And here's some great photos from the book of the Facettes. At the Lou Reed show, they did Lou Baby and did a cheerleader routine in front of Lou Reed, at the Lou Reed Transformer, which is a pivotal glam album in general.
Yeah, you do talk about, you mentioned that in the book.
But they did performances as well at Faces. So those were the real performances that happened there.
But what was the comment on Lou Reed's Transformer? Was there something about in Canada they weren't selling the album, or there was something in... So
in an issue of The Body Politic, which is a very important queer publication that came out of Canada, came out of Toronto. In an early issue, there was an article asking, and when would it be? It would have been like maybe early 70s, this issue, right around that time. And it was basically going, where is the gay music? And then in that article, the writer says, yeah, RCA were not going to release it in Canada because they didn't see a market for it. They didn't see a market for Transformer. So they did, thank God, they did release it in Canada. And, Lou Reed toured it in Canada. You see he did the, Transformer tour in Vancouver that the Facettes were at. And it looks like quite a show. So thankfully it was released, but that's kind of what we're up against. Canada's a bit culturally conservative. So,
and there's some other interesting sidebars along the way. Also, there's one on the Guess Who song Glamour Boy. Burton Cummings, not exactly a fan of these fellow Canadian bands, apparently. You call this song simultaneously shitty and great. Tell us about this song.
Yeah, it's shitty and great. Yeah, I think that's accurate. I apparently Burton Cummings did come around. But at that song, he's, being very, very cynical and harsh lyrics about glam rock. And, and these lyrics, these lyrics are a real eye roll. What is it, like $25,000 make you look like a woman tonight? Something like that. Right. I think it's the gist of it. And, so you got these like just bad, and you're like, oh man. And then, but then he gets to these lines about these beautiful poetic lines, this other part of the song about the archer and all this. It's amazing. Burton Cummings blows my mind in how sometimes he can be both, yes, incredibly shitty and incredibly great. He's got this fantastic voice, but then some of the material is like you look at look at the album Lady Love, which you'd see in every thrift store, his solo album. It's like him on the piano on the cover, and he's looking up between a pair of giant legs, a giant woman's legs. So it's like he's like a little man playing the piano, looking up between her legs. That's the album cover, and you go, yeah, that's Burton Cummings. Like it's when you think of Glamour Boy, you go, wow, there's some incredible stuff, amazing stuff in this song, and incredibly shitty stuff in the same
Yeah.
song. And I'm sorry, I should really backtrack also with that song by the Guess Who. Of course, that song is in the book. Guess Who is not really seen as glam per se. I'm not putting them in as a glam act,
Right.
but they did do a song that was about glam. So a
About
Canadian
glam.
band did
So
a song about glam.
that's what's cool about these sidebars. There's a connection to glam. It doesn't necessarily have to be the band is glam. Now, here's a name that I know of so well, but I did not know it's from Canada. K-Tel. Anybody who's, I would say, 50 or older, even in their maybe mid 40s here in the States, know about it. And I didn't know it originated out of Canada. For those who may not know what K-Tel is, can you just fill them in on that and give us some of the history, which is also covered in this book?
K-Tel's pretty interesting. I almost wonder, and I really need to talk to someone about this. Did they eliminate the need for door-to-door salesmen? Because it was all about order now, call now, get these
Yeah.
devices. It's very much that kind of thing, that kind of marketing. They had all their products, the slices, the dices, all that stuff you get. But then they also got into what most of us know now, records. And they were able to really make compilations. And it was all about making compilations where they hit it really big, putting all these songs together, licensing, getting all these songs. And then they were also able to do it Reader's Digest style sometimes and take the longer songs and cut them down, make them really short, pack all these songs in. So it was like 20 big hits, on and on and on. And they were, Phil Kives, the founder of K-Tel, he's Canadian, and they were out of Canada. They were out of Winnipeg. K-Tel was out of Winnipeg, Manitoba. So when you look at these K-Tel album covers too, they look especially glammy. You get these stars coming out at you on the covers and everything. They really, I don't know who their layout person was, but they really made things look bigger than life. And of course, they had a lot of TV advertising with the big booming voices of boom, 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 rapid fire of all the artists. Get this and this and this on each thing. They even as well celebrated Canada. They would put a lot of Canadian content on their albums. They had one called Canadian Mint. It was really a pivotal album because it's all Canadian and there's a lot of glammy stuff on that one. Even acts that aren't glammy per se are doing songs that are kind of glammy. A lot of these bands would be on there. Stampeders, On and On, Flood, they'd all be on these comps.
But they did spread out into bands like the Kinks, and I know that because as a huge Van Halen fan, Van Halen cut their teeth during their club days on a lot of Kinks songs. And there was an article that talks about whether it was David Lee Roth or one of the guys in the band had K-Tel Kinks greatest hits. And so that's how they were able to memorize all those songs by having the K-Tel compilation.
I didn't know that
Kinks.
K-Tel did a Kinks greatest hits.
Apparently.
Wow.
I think Dave was the one who told that story. I love the K-Tel had a spoken album about people's encounters with the Loch Ness Monster.
Yeah. So K-Tel, of course, as I say, did a lot of repackaging, and they had incredible distribution. So people would hear about these Canadian acts and all these acts from all over the place because K-Tel had range. Distribution was incredible. One of their albums, though, is a little harder to find, and it's an original album. So there's not a lot of original K-Tel albums. There's very, very few, in fact. And this one was done just for the K-Tel label, and it was done by Alex Harvey of the sensational Alex Harvey Band. K-Tel's a mystery. I really try to figure out the origins of some of these things, and it's been difficult. Even trying to speak to K-Tel, it's difficult to try to get the origins of how Alex Harvey of the sensational Alex Harvey Band, which is a great, well-loved European glam band. He's incredible. I mean, he's such this charismatic front man. He's the best. But he was also, I guess, interested in the Loch Ness Monster. So he does this spoken word kind of audio documentary interviewing people around Loch Ness and sightings of the Loch Ness Monster. And there's one little song on it. It's kind of a jaunty little folk song, but it's mostly spoken word. Richard O'Brien from Rocky Horror Picture Show shows up on the album to talk with them.
That's got to
And
be hard to find nowadays.
it's elusive. I have not been able to find a copy. I've
Yeah.
got a couple of the other original K-Tel albums, and I've got one called Funtown that's a puppet album, Archie Wood and Friends. I had that album as a kid because up in Fort St. John, British Columbia, K-Tel, of course, would get out there too. Again, incredible distribution. And I'd stare and look at these puppets on the album cover and go, who are these guys? I'm like a little kid going, who are these puppets?
Yeah.
What's the story? And I know nothing about these puppets, and they're doing these songs, and it seems like it's all one take, and it's these puppets singing over stock Moog backing tracks, doing all covers. One called "Hey Tuttle," where Tuttle Turtle's singing to Marvin Mouse. And when I first heard "Hey Jude," I went, they're ripping off "Hey Tuttle." This is Tuttle Turtle's song. What's going on here? And then I find out that no. And then I find out years later that this was a Winnipeg, where K-Tel was the home base of. It was a Winnipeg children's show that ran for years with Uncle Bob Schwartz, who then I also found out, I moved to Vancouver. I find out all this info, and I find it out from friends who are from Winnipeg as well. Like I find out that Uncle Bob Schwartz is the puppeteer and host of Funtown, that he dated my first girlfriend's mother, and
Oh
all
my
this
God.
stuff. I'm like, oh, this is legit.
Yeah.
But he did this album for K-Tel, so anyone outside of Winnipeg would go, what is this? What are all these puppets? And then people in Winnipeg would know that it was this regional children's show.
Man. Just trying to imagine, like, yeah, it was some business meeting, like, got a great idea. We got a album where people talk about their encounters with a Loch Ness monster. All right, let's do it. Let's do it.
It's kind of amazing. They do this, they do Funtown, they do
Right.
one called Rock Fantasy that's pretty glammy, and it's about the land where animals are people and the people are the animals. And my band July 4th Toilet, we covered that whole album from start to finish. We dressed as the animals, and we were all the animals personified, like Sir Dandelion singing "You Don't Need a Crown to Be a King." And we're going, "What's this story? Who recorded this?" And we couldn't get to the bottom of it. We tried to reach out and find info. Definitely know that K-Tel would buy labels like the label that Jewel Akins was on with Birds and the Bees, and so some of those songs were covered or done for Rock Fantasy. But yeah, that Rock Fantasy, the land where animals were people. So the original albums that K-Tel did were pretty bonkers. So
I'm just thinking, was there ever a documentary done on K-Tel? There should. Boy,
I
there's your next project right there.
no, I think that I'm
Or has there
I'm
been
trying to
made?
think that there was some sort of short film. Did Clint Enns do it? Filmmaker Clint Enns. I'm trying to think. I think Clint Enns might have done something with the K-Tel that, like, some Winnipeg folks might have done it, because there is the Winnipeg Film Co-op and there is a Winnipeg film scene. And so I'm trying to think if there was, but has there been a feature length doc on K-Tel? I'm not
That'd be cool.
sure.
That would be
That
cool.
would be,
Let's go back because I know we were starting really with the year 1970, but let's go back one more year to 1969, Toronto's rock and roll revival, 1969. And the theory you pose in the book, it's a preposterous theory, you call it, but aren't the best theories preposterous?
yeah. Like this book, I mean, this book, like, people go, oh, he's covering all these Canadian glam bands. Well, honestly, I'm having to, like, this is a difficult thing, especially in Canada, where you go, oh, I got to kind of create my own way here and stumble and flail along and figure it out and go, okay, what are the glam qualifiers? What would qualify as glam? And getting into like endless like discussions with record collectors and music fans who like me collect all these bands and who have done incredible work in their own right as well. People like say Kevin Howes, or who has done Jamaica to Toronto, and has also done Native North America. We would get into these long discussions, or Ian Marshall, who's done a lot of interesting work as well. We would talk about all this stuff, like, is this glam, isn't this glam? We'd listen to it, oh yeah, so we like, okay, they got the visual sound, they got this, they got the camp sensibility, on and on and on. Like, what's this, what's that? And then it's like, I'm looking at the rock and roll revival, and everyone was super fixated on the John Lennon aspect. But for me, I'm looking at this stuff going, this is 1969, and Johnny Brower has made this concert, and there is a documentary about it out now too, as well. There is a documentary on the rock and roll revival that's come out in the last couple of years. So John Brower, of course, the big thing is getting John Lennon, but he had done a previous thing as well, which had some of these old 50s rock bands. And you think, like, old 50s rock bands, it's 1969. It's only like a dozen years later, but let's hear it for, the fact of like you hit 30, you're done or something. I don't know, like the whole ageism of rock and roll. These guys were like, these original rock and rollers were probably only like what in their mid 30s, if that,
Yeah.
they're playing these concerts. And so he's doing one before the rock and roll revival. And I think the Velvet Underground played that too. So it was a mix of like, these rock and roll bands and that. And then he gets this big concert and it's all about getting, so the story of the documentary is all about getting John Lennon because it's needs John Lennon. But yeah, the John Lennon part's pretty interesting because, it shows that the 60s are almost over. The Beatles are really breaking up. They broke up what, like a week later or something. It's his first show with the Plastic Ono band, and they're doing 50s rock and roll covers, but they're kind of like shaggy hippies doing it. They got their long hair and stuff, but they're doing the 50s rock and roll. But then you also have the Plastic Ono band. I mean, it is the Plastic Ono band, but you have Yoko Ono. You got Yoko Ono doing her groundbreaking stuff. And I would have loved to have been there to see how the crowd is reacting to Yoko. I'm a Yoko Ono fan. I'm like, how is the
Cool.
crowd reacting to this? This is really pushing the
Sure.
boundaries of rock and roll.
That's avant-garde.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's
that's
bringing Fluxus. It's bringing Fluxus to the masses. Speaking of, I bring up Al Hansen from Fluxus earlier. Now I'm bringing up Yoko Ono from Fluxus. So we're bringing the art to the masses here at this giant concert in Toronto. And then you're having like Alice Cooper Band. It's their earlier days too. They haven't teamed up with Bob Ezrin yet, but they're doing an incredible performance, and it's almost blinding. It's they're way more tripped out by this at this point, but it's still, heading into their, like they later become a real glam, they're known as a glam band, but at this point they're more trippy. And
isn't
there's the
that
chicken incident, which
the
really
chicken incident?
propelled their
Yeah,
fame.
that's where the chicken incident took
The
place. Yeah.
chicken incident's there, and then they're backing up. Who are they backing up? Gene
Gene
Vincent.
Vincent.
They're
Yeah.
backing up Gene Vincent, and also you have like Little Richard's back, and he's in full form, like full force. He's wearing a mirrored like top, and he's like, "No, turn the lights on me!" Like he's like so it can reflect and be blind. So it's incredibly visual, and he's like just incredible. Hey, I saw him in the late '90s, and he was incredible. Like he's like he's a great. Just I mean, he is Little Richard is everything. Little
Yeah.
Richard is everything. Let's just stop and say this right now. Little Richard is everything.
Yeah.
So
Performance, the music, the look, the whole thing. Your theory is maybe that this
the
this
glam
might be
god.
this might be the start of glam right there. I mean, that's
Yeah,
that chicken incident,
yeah.
by the way. Wasn't it that Alice threw the chickens in the audience thinking they would fly, and then people threw them back up on stage, and one of them hit one of the fans, and it just became a whole mess. But then he
You
got
know,
headlines from it.
yeah, and the thing is, it's trying to parse the actual incident, from the legend.
The
Like
lore,
they
yeah.
kind of because it creates the legend and it propels a really excellent documentary to see on Alice Cooper. My dear friend Reg Harkema, who's also helpful with the book as well. Reg directed a doc called Super Duper Alice Cooper. That's a great doc
Oh,
on
I've
Alice.
heard of it. Yeah, I have to
Yeah,
see
I
it.
really recommend that. It's a great doc that gets into that. And actually, it's an incredible doc because it gets into so many aspects of their career. It also gets into the early aspects of where they were in LA. It's funny because last night I was out front of Cantor's. I think I was probably not far from where the original Alice Cooper band got their figure skating outfits from. I think I was in that neighborhood last night as I was
Wow.
talking with some folks about this. And, with the GTOs, the great band, the GTOs, these incredible women basically saying, dress like this. So, and you see that in glam, like a lot of incredible, like I talked about, like the glitter on Mark Bolan's face. Mark Bolan didn't do that. A woman did that, like these incredible women doing this, and so in this case, it was the GTOs whose album, one of the best names for an album ever, Permanent Damage. They did
Yeah.
that. And of course, Alice Cooper later, connects with Bob Ezrin, the Canadian producer, Bob Ezrin, who really pushes their sound forward into the glam era. But yeah, at that rock and roll revival, there's that shock rock, there's that performance, there's all that early rock and roll sound. It's called the rock and roll revival, and then we're moving further into like art and performance with Yoko Ono, and it's got all those elements, and also the MCs were, Kim Fowley was MCing the show too, and he's done some glammy stuff in his own right. He's the nasty Sven Galley.
Yeah, I don't think it's that preposterous. I think that theory there's some merit to that.
It's
That
1969,
yeah,
and the 60s are over. To me, that's the real concert that shows the end of the 60s
yep,
and moving into the glam era. I
yeah.
know we could talk Woodstock or Altamont, whatever. I think the Toronto Rock and Roll Revival concert was the one that really propelled us into the glam era.
Let's talk about Thundermug simply because it's such a great name. Who is Thundermug, and what did the mother of one of the band members say about that name and what it means?
He tells me the story. He's telling the story of he comes up with the band name Thunderbug. Because again, this is a band, we talk about the visual sensibility of Glam. This is a band you put on their first couple albums. They have you put it, especially you put on In Orbit, especially, but even the first album, you put it on and you go, oh, this is a visual band. This is loud. You're meant to
Yeah.
physically feel this music. And that's the thing. Glam in the early 70s is using that recording technology to make things bigger sounding, and and to make it more visual, make it larger than life. And Thundermug was like that. So he comes up with a name like Thundermug. You go, that's a very visual name. Well, for his mother, it gave off the wrong visual because it's supposed to be, I believe, she said it was a bedpan. It's slang for bedpan. So,
Who's gonna find out? Who's gonna? Don't worry,
but
ma. Nobody's gonna know.
no one's gonna know. I think they might have been like, if I look at one of those, I look at their third album. I think Tada. I think it's very. Their album covers look really glammy too.
Yeah.
Even though they were kind of shaggy and hairy, they did get into some of the, like, because there was a real Toronto soul revival scene in the where people would wear costumes and everything, and these kind of bands that would, like Mandala and stuff, they would wear like a lot of costumes. They got into wearing costumes too. Thundermug at one point, though it kind of backfired on them, but they were more shaggy looking. But if you look at their album covers and you listen to their albums, it's very, very glam sounding. And I think Tada has I think it's actually a bedpan. I think they actually did use the bedpan visual, and it's got lightning striking the bedpan.
Oh, is that the
It's,
one? Yeah, because I put "Bad Guy" in the playlist for this episode. That's from that
oh,
album.
great!
That's a great
That's from
song.
that album. Yeah, yeah.
That's a great song.
No, wait, Bad Guy might be from In Orbit actually.
Is it?
I think, yeah, In Orbit's my favorite. That album, like, In Orbit is incredible from start to finish. Yeah, Bad Guy's the last song on In Orbit. That's
All
right.
right.
I was DJing a show and I brought In Orbit and I was going, what song do we choose from here? They're all great.
Well, speaking of that, I'm wondering what other bands like Thundermug that you may be surprised it didn't become worldwide sensations. Rough Trade may be one of those because you said
Yeah,
they were
and
trailblazers ahead of their time. Tell us about this band and what became of them.
we talk about that. We talk about how it's in the chapter where I interviewed Kevin Staples and I also did an email interview with Carol Pope and also interviewed Marilyn Kewitt, who did a lot of their fashion too. So we get into their look as well. When I interviewed Kevin Staples, because Rough Trade was founded by Carol Pope and Kevin Staples, and we talk about that. They were poised for stardom, opening for Bowie on the Serious Moonlight tour, a little earlier on, doing all these other things too. That in Toronto, you'd see them open for Sparks, stuff like that. In the mid 70s. They formed in the very early 70s, I believe. Yeah, because they started playing in like '69 as O. For a long time, they released an album in '75, and their first album, was released in '75, which was recorded direct to disc, a curious recording process of trying to get the best sound perfectly, recording live to, geez, what is the process? A lot of these audio files track down that first album. I'm getting ahead of myself. That it is in the book. But after that first album, there's a 5-year gap between albums. They were unsigned. They were doing television. They were doing packed shows. They were getting written about. They were incredibly popular, and they didn't have a record deal until finally they do the Junos. And the Junos is what everyone glibly calls Canada's answer to the Grammys. And they're very provocative on the Junos because they do the song High School Confidential, which became a hit for them. So they were actually asked to perform High School Confidential on the Junos. And they had their friend, the late, great Sparkle, dress up in drag and sashay around the stage. So this is what it is. And I want to be absolutely correct and accurate about this. This is a quote from Carol Pope from the book Cold Glitter. She says, "They asked me not to grab my crotch. I did. It was live TV, and I knew they couldn't stop me." So
That's rock and roll. That's rock and
then,
roll right there.
then they got signed. And then they got signed right after that performance. They got signed. I'm not sure how it worked with the labels and the U.S. distribution, the U.S. arms, and all that stuff. But they really did want to push and go further, especially after the Bowie thing. But it's just hard in Canada. It's hard when you really, you want to break out, and they did very, very well. I mean, and they still reunite to this day, and they're a great, great band.
What's this all female group in the book called the Clichettes? They took lip syncing to new ambitious levels. Who were the, am I pronouncing that right? The Clichettes?
The Clichettes are an all-woman performance group, and they would often do shows with Rough Trade as well. And they also did their full-scale 90-minute productions with costume changes and everything. And the Clichettes, again, it's a mixing of art. There's a definite art practice in there where they would lip sync songs, but they would twist them around. It's had a very feminist perspective with some of these songs, and they would take, say, for example, that ridiculous Paul Anka song, "Having My Baby," and they would take that and twist it on his head and subvert it because that song deserves to be subverted. And they were just incredible at lip syncing. Like, they took lip syncing to the next level, and they were incredible. If you see footage of them, and they did have a retrospective show, I believe it might even still be on at McMaster University, a retrospective of the Clichettes. And a lot of them came from an experimental dance background as well. They all met through experimental dance and modern dance. And yeah, they were great. Then they didn't want to be known as a nostalgia act because people thought, okay, they performed at like Yuck Yucks, a comedy club. And they went, and people thought, oh, they're a nostalgia act, or the club did. And it's like, well, no, we're not a nostalgia act. We're an anti-nostalgia act. They're using old songs, but they're being anti-nostalgic. And they're very sharp, very funny, very feminist, very great. And so what they did was they brought in another writer, and they wrote a full-scale production. Like, it was a full-scale show, the full-on 90-minute show. So they would do some performances that were just, if they'd opened for Rough Trade, for example, I imagine it would be a much shorter set, but they also had their own shows, so full-scale theatrical shows.
The band considered to be the first glam band from the province of Quebec is Mac, and this is
Yes.
a band who worked their asses off. They could have opened for the New York Dolls, which would have been huge, but that fell through.
So with Mac and a lot of other bands, these were touring musicians. Canada, another reason that's really difficult with Canada is, this book has a map, right? The wonderful designers of this book just really did it as a map. And so, you see this map. Canada's a giant country. It's giant. The West Coast, often you would just have to try to get over the border. You'd be in Vancouver or something, like the West Coast in Vancouver, Victoria, whatever. And then you'd have to deal with the border, the hassle of the border to get to Seattle and then go along to Olympia, Portland, all that stuff as a touring musician onto LA. But then you get the eastern part of the country and you have all these towns and everything in Ontario, Quebec, on and on and on. And you'd be traveling these highways and byways. Sometimes if you're on the West Coast, you'd be traveling the East Coast, and East, you'd be traveling West. That would happen too. And if it's winter, it's treacherous. The roads are treacherous. You're clocking all these miles, or as we call them, clicks, kilometers. And you'd be like clocking all this and going, it's not safe, these treacherous roads. And a member of Mac died, trying to get to one of these shows in one of these towns, because that's what you do as a touring musician, trying to get all these little towns in Canada. And you work
Wow.
your ass off. And Mac did work their asses off, and they lost a band member as a result. He died.
What happened? Car accident?
Yeah, it was on the highway in the middle of
Oh,
winter.
man.
Yeah, somewhere in Quebec.
A lot of these bands were so good, but they were just up against this. I don't know. For some reason, these bands from Canada, it's like nobody wanted to give them the attention they deserved, at least here in the States and other parts of the world. They really should
Well,
have.
if you're multidisciplinary, again, we bring up that word multidisciplinary. It often means you're not playing it safe. And, a lot of times with
Right.
the industry, it's all like, we talk about, Rough Trade being extremely popular with people for 5 years. But where's the industry? Where the hell's the industry? And it's the people in Canada love this stuff. But the industry, it's like, play it safe. Don't make waves. Don't be
Yeah.
multidisciplinary. Don't confuse me. Don't make waves. Please be boring. This stuff is anything but boring.
Oh, I know. That's the thing. It's so entertaining. And the music, as I listen to this and put together the playlist, which people can, if they go to the show notes, click the link, and there's a Spotify playlist there. I'm just like, damn, this stuff is good. And this is stuff I've never heard before.
I know,
Honestly,
isn't
I
it
mean,
a shame? This is great
right,
music.
right. And you talked about the maps in the book, a lot of great photos in the book. And there's one that's a bit creepy. If you've seen the Strangers movies, and this will remind you of those movies, the photo is from 1966. A group of people with sacks over their heads with holes cut out for their eyes looking at the camera. These are known as mummers. Connected to this
Yeah.
photo is an album from 1975 called The New, here we go. Test me on this. Newfoundland. You got to say
So it's
Newfound very quickly. You got to say Newfoundland.
this is
Newfoundland.
ridiculous, because like even on Canadian radio, like Newfoundland didn't join Canada until 1949, and it was begrudgingly so. It's like, joining Canada. There was a lot of people who were like in Newfoundland who were going, we don't want to join Canada. And then you get the Canadian radio DJs in Canada going, Newfoundland,
Yeah.
because it was a four and a
Newfoundland.
half hour time change. So it'd be like 6 p.m. in Vancouver, 10:30 p.m. in Newfoundland. It's
I
like,
did
no,
my homework.
Newfoundland.
I looked it up, went to many YouTube videos, and there was this one kid on TikTok, and he was teaching you how to say. He says, Newfound's got, you got to say it very quickly. Newfoundland.
Newfoundland.
Okay.
You got it.
Yeah, it's,
I think we got it. We need
yeah,
to talk to someone from Newfoundland to really make sure, but I think we
right.
got it.
So who are
And
the
I
mummers,
think
and what's this song, Shock Absorbers? This really fill listeners in on the photo, the album.
the Mummers is, and it's funny you say like, oh, the Stranger stuff. Well, the Mummers predates all that stuff. Like I really think that Mummers is a real Mummers is a folk tradition, and the Mummers is very different from the Philadelphia Mummers. We're talking going back to the Isles, hundreds of years. Yeah,
Showing the picture
that's a
here,
very,
folks.
yeah. So it enters. I call it, folk horror glam there, but it predates glam. It predates all this stuff. It may even predate Halloween, the actual custom of Halloween, the mummering tradition, where you get whatever. And the great thing is it's also very like, again, kind of like glam, where the fans would dress up. It's very like egalitarian, where you dress up with whatever's in your house, and you go around door to door, and you go, any mummers allowed in, and you disguise your voice, and they have to guess who you are. And so the mummering tradition is incredible tradition, and every year and still practiced in various regions in Newfoundland and Labrador. And also, there's a mummer parade. I've been a couple times and dressed up in St. John's, Newfoundland, where you all dress up in
Nice.
December. And it's sort of around the solstice, not far from that time. So there is that kind of folk horror tradition. So that's the mummers. And so I had to put the mummers in there because there is just such glam overlap, and Shock Absorber was done by Peter Francis Quinlan. He made this. So I don't know how I stumbled onto this, but he basically says, yeah, oh, well, there's no real, again, there's a lot of folk traditions in Newfoundland, but he's going, well, Newfoundland needs a rock song. So he writes this song called His Car's Busted, His Shock Absorbers Broke on the Highway. He goes, I'll write a rock song about it. And it's this really trouble, like not this very flawed, hilariously flawed sexual analogy where I'm going to be your shock absorber tonight. Which to me, it's a great song.
There's so many entertaining stories and photos, and it's all in this book. And it's out now. Cold Glitter, The Untold Story of Canadian Glam. Find it wherever books are sold. Pick up a copy at your local bookstore if you can. Support your local bookstore. There's a link to find your nearest store at bookedonrock.com. Where can people find you online, Robert?
Right. And I should say that what we talked about today, we just touched on it.
Tip of the iceberg. Yeah.
Yeah.
Apologies to all of the
Over
other bands and artists that we did not mention in this book. It's only just because we would be here all day. So
No,
I just plucked out a few.
there's a lot in there.
Yeah.
So please, I would love you all to read it. And you can find me at www. And it's a Feral House book. See, I constantly do this. See, one more thing. It's a Feral House book published by Feral House. And you can find me at www.robertdayton.com. And I'm probably somewhere out on various other social media, Blue Sky, stuff like that too. I'm easy to find, but robertdayton.com.
Awesome. Robert, thank you, man. This was awesome.
Thanks for having me today. I really appreciate it. Thanks for taking the time.